Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Trying something different for this video. No visual footage of me running or anything. I'm actually going to be here. This is very weird, but I guess I'll get used to it. If this is something that you guys like and if it's something that I find to be useful and interesting. Let me stop clicking this pen because I feel like that's going to get caught in the audio. So this video is going to be a good bit of word vomit. I have some ideas that I've been wrestling with over the past few weeks, and I felt some thoughts or noticed some ideas come to my mind as I was running this morning, and so wanted to try to capture those in a video and share these thoughts with you guys and see what you think. So on my run this morning, I was thinking about sacrifice and suffering and our relationship with those two phenomena. When I say our relationship, I mean at the individual level, how I view sacrifice and suffering, what they mean, how to adequately embody them, why do they exist in the first place, and also the relationship of our current society with sacrifice and suffering and how they seem to be conceptualized at a broader level. It's hard to try to make those assertions because there's no way that I know how our culture, how our society, whatever that is, whatever that means, understands sacrifice and suffering. But there are just some events, current events, conversations that I, have randomly with people at work or people in my life that maybe enables me to tap into generally how our culture feels about those things. But either way, I'm going to do my best. And I also believe that I'm not that different from people, and I am a part of culture, obviously, and so I'm not that. The individual level of analysis can be useful, and sometimes extrapolated up to that of the cultural level analysis, but obviously you lose some things in translation. So anyway, sacrifice and suffering. I think part of why those two ideas have been on my mind recently for a long time, but more conscious recently, is because I've been thinking about this idea that Jordan Peterson has been continuing to say, and said a few years back, is that we view the world through a story. And I believe that the first time I encountered that notion was while listening to one of his lectures on Genesis. I believe the title of that series was called The Psychological Significance of the Bible. It's one of his most famous, most viewed set of lectures that can be found on YouTube, and I highly recommend that people go and watch those. And his notion was something like this, and it's evolved over the years, but it's something along the lines of reality, whatever that is, could be construed as an infinite set of facts. And given that we are limited creatures, we cannot contend with all of those facts. And so we have to overlay an interpretive structure on our environment or reality so that way we can get a grip on it and make decisions and act. It's difficult to act and analyze at the same time. And so if we had to deal with the never-ending complexity of reality, and we'd have a hard time acting, or we could never act because we would always be trying to weigh different probabilities and different options and assess our risk. And, given that we don't want to die and that we want to find love and that we want to reproduce and live comfortably, there's just too much information in the infinite reality for us to manage. And so we have to overlay what Dr. Peterson calls a story, or what I think Thomas Sowell in his book A Conflict of Visions calls a vision, onto the world, so that way we essentially blind ourselves or put a band-aid, for lack of better terms, over that infinite complexity. And we do that by setting assumptions. And so, some fundamental questions are, well, what's the nature of human beings? Are we inherently good or are we inherently evil? And here I'm taking from Thomas Sowell. Is wisdom to be found in tradition or in the intellect and reasoning faculty of contemporary man? What are some other questions? What's real? What is truth? What is meaning? What is beauty? What is good? These fundamental questions, while I'm saying them in semantic terms, we act out the answers to those questions, or we at least attempt to, all the time. And so, given that we can't contend with reality, we have to have an ideology or belief system or a paradigm or a vision, which is the interpretive structure that enables us to contend with reality. And again, the story is a set of assumptions. And here I'll say that there's an argument that all stories, all interpretations of the world are relative and equal in value, but different. And so the way that Christians view the world compared to the way that Muslims view the world, compared to the way that secular humanists view the world, there's no way to judge them on their own merits according to some people, and these would be the moral relativists. And these views are all different, and who's to say who was right? And that's something that we seem to be struggling with in our culture today. I'll have conversations with people at work, people in my life, and I'll be pretty upfront about my beliefs and how I think people should act, which is probably the ultimate question that all of this is revolving around, which maybe I'll get to in a few minutes. And people will say things like, well, that's just your perspective, or that's your interpretation. I'll be discussing a current event with a friend, and I'll say that it's evil or it's wrong, or I'll say, well, I think this should have happened, or I think this needs to happen. And they'll say, well, that's just your interpretation. What gives you the right to judge these people and judge the actions of others? And to some extent, it is an interesting argument, but one of the ways I've tried to get around that is in behavior and in looking at people's actions. And it's not really a way to argue directly against moral relativists. But when I think about the different stories that we could embody and believe in to use to act in the world, I kind of take a pragmatic perspective here, and I just say, well, if you were to act out that story, would you get what you wanted? And then we can extrapolate up to a more social level. And I think, well, if the society, to the degree that a society embodies one story over another, do more people want to live in that society? Is that society flourishing more than others? And then someone could make the argument, well, flourishing is a vague term and people have different goals, and it's an assumption that human life is good and that flourishing is good and that it's moral to not kill people, not murder people, and not increase unnecessary suffering. For people who would say that the assumption that let me get this right. For people who would say that we should assume that humans need to flourish and that we know what flourishing is, I don't really want to engage in conversation with those people. And then you can get to the question of, you can continue to peel back the layers here and, try to rationalize this. But at some point, there are just some people that I'm not willing to have a conversation with if my goal is to better understand these stories and what the proper story would be. And so my belief is that we have various goals and desires. Some of those are biological, some of those are social. There is a category of flourishing, and then there's a category of misery and tragedy and unnecessary suffering, and we can draw a line between those two things, and we can point towards flourishing and away from unnecessary suffering. But if someone were to say, well, one person's flourishing can be another person's suffering, and so it's all relative, at this point in my life, I'm just not willing to engage in conversation with those people, because I feel like we have enough problems as they are. Okay. Going back to stories. Part of the fundamental question, one fundamental question that we have always probably, is how to act in the world, which is related to the question of which story are we supposed to embody. And in the West, and this is something that Dr. Peterson is continually trying to push among other people, the thought is that the Bible, the biblical corpus, as he calls it, is an attempt to characterize the optimal, ideal story. And another thing about stories, which is really cool, is that, and this is coming from John Vervaeke, my understanding from what he said is that the story, the oral story, is humanity's first technology, first tool, first invention. And then that kind of begs the question, well, what is the point of the narrative? And one answer could be, the point of a story is to teach distilled wisdom to younger generations and to other people that will have staying power and will enable them to continually, consistently survive and reproduce and flourish. And I think there's a valid point to that. I definitely believe there's a biological case to it. I think there's a psychological case to be made there. And also just I keep coming back to what my understanding of a pragmatic principle here is. It's, well, if you act in this way and get what you want, then the way you acted is good enough. And then you can judge these actions that stem from the stories that you embody on their capacity to continually have predictive power and enable you to get what you want, and also generalize. And all of that hypothetically would be in the substrate, or on top of the substrate of a moral good. So I was reading, what's it called? One book that I'm reading right now is called The Working Brain, and it's an introduction to neuropsychology, and is written by Alexander Luria I think it was published in 1973 in the Soviet Union. And so where I'm at right now, Luria is talking about different units of the brain, or you could say they're different networks or systems of the brain. And one of the systems that he's talking about is responsible for waking and cortical tonality, which the way I'm understanding that is, it's the intensity or attention that's turned up or down depending on the context. And this structure, this unit, is throughout the brain, but primarily is related to the brainstem and the older parts of our brain. And it modulates, depending on the information that it receives, how alert you need to be to specific actions and things that you need to do. And one of the manifestations of this system is called the orienting reflex. And my understanding of the orienting reflex is that if there's something novel in your environment, this system will activate and instinctually, reflexively push you to, look at, face the novel stimulus and explore if need be. And this is much of this happens unconsciously. And part of that struck me. I've heard Dr. Peterson talk about this so many times, but this is my first time encountering it in a text and being able to really sit and think about it. And part of what interests me about this is that, well, what does that mean that you encounter a novel stimulus? Well, part of that means that there has to be a system or a way for you to continually track the environment, or else how would you know what's new? And so this is where your memory systems come in, and from my understanding, mediated by your hippocampi, or the hippocampus. And so you have this internal model of the world, or you have expectations, you have past experience. Like, your mind is tracking what's the status quo. And when something, and another thing that's cool is that you're always tracking, you're always receiving information from the outside world, perhaps maybe even when you're asleep. But given that we have a reflex for dealing with novel stimuli, to me, this is the beginning, or at least part of, like, a biological connection to the story that I've been talking about, or the interpretive structure, or the paradigm, the vision that I've been talking about for the past few minutes here. And so what's the story? Well, I know what's going on right now, or at least I think I know what's going on right now. I think that I have this status quo, and this is my brain is tracking this. I have my internal body budget, my internal economy, meaning, like, okay, am I hungry? Am I too cold? Too hot? Are my basic needs satisfied? And what's my respiration like? What's my heartbeat like? What's my blood pressure? And all that's being tracked internally. So that's one source of information that's part of this status quo. And then I also have memory. I've been to some of these places before. I've existed in this time and in this space and under these contexts, and so I have some memory or expectations for how things are supposed to be. At the same time, I also have goals and desires, and I have plans that take into account where I am and where I've been. But some of these goals and plans are going to require me to go to new places. So I'm at point A, which is my status quo, and I'm trying to go to point B. And as I'm going to point B, I'm going to encounter different things, and most of it's going to be irrelevant, but some of these things are going to be tools, and some of these things are going to be obstacles. And to me, like, that's the story. And it's cool to learn that we have neurobiological mechanisms for consciously and unconsciously delineating the different parts of those stories. And so, we plan and we set goals, and we take into account our current status quo and our current surroundings and environment, and we have a baseline from which we're able to juxtapose a novel stimulus to even determine that it's novel in the first place. And much of that happens unconsciously. And so when I think about the story, I think about this, I don't want to say at a rudimentary level, but at a very fundamental level, just hierarchically nested into more abstracted, I guess. What I'm thinking about is that the story that I've been alluding to, a way to look through the world, is an abstract version of what's actually happening at some of these subcortical levels. Okay, story. Suffering and sacrifice. I mentioned that the Bible is an attempt to elucidate some of these patterns of stories, to try to distill different patterns of behavior and convey to us how we're supposed to act and how we're not supposed to act. One story early in the Old Testament is the story of Cain and Abel. And Cain and Abel are the sons of Adam and Eve. Cain is a farmer, I believe, and Abel is a shepherd. And they're both supposed to sacrifice to God to receive a blessing. Abel gives the fattiest part of his first flock, if I remember the details correctly, and he sacrifices this to God, and he receives the blessing. And then Cain sacrifices his fruit or some crops, and he does not get a blessing. And part of the text, if I remember correctly, there were deliberate details about Abel's sacrifice, and saying that it's of the first flock, and is also the fattiest portions. And so the notion there is that, excuse me, his sacrifice was valuable and correct, and a high sacrifice. Now with Cain, in this part of the Bible, it doesn't specifically say that his sacrifice was suboptimal, but if you juxtapose the description of his sacrifice compared to Abel, you can then say that he sacrificed less than. So Cain doesn't receive the blessing, and he essentially blames God. And I think he has a conversation with God, and he's like, "Why? How come I didn't receive the blessing? Why did you set the world up this way?" And God turns it around on Cain and says that you did this. And so, what does Cain do here? He could make the decision to be a better person, make a better sacrifice, learn from Abel, and understand what it means to sacrifice properly. But instead, he takes Abel out into the woods or out into the fields and kills him. If I remember how this story ends, everyone finds out that Cain killed Abel. God, I can't remember if God curses Cain or not, but Cain understands that he did wrong, and he says something along the lines of, "This sin is too much for me to bear," and he receives what's called the mark of Cain from God, because people were going to come after him, and God wanted to protect him, and so my memory of the story runs out there. But one lesson from the story that I extrapolate, and that I've heard people take from the story and their interpretations that I agree with, is that you have this juxtaposition of two forms of sacrifice, and you have Abel's sacrifice, which is the highest, perhaps the best sacrifice, and he receives the blessing. And then you see Cain, who sacrifices in a lackluster manner and does not receive the blessing. And then on top of that, you have this choice, or after that, you have this choice where Cain could repent and learn and become better, or you can blame everything externally and not take ownership of your situation and not take responsibility and accountability, and give into your resentment that builds up because things didn't go your way. So we have two choices here that arise from this story, and the injunction seems to be, in the first choice, you're supposed to sacrifice properly. If you want to receive the blessing of God, then you need to sacrifice properly. And we can ask the question, well, is that true? Is that something that if you act out, it will work? I think that's... So I'm currently in marathon training, and I'm just trying to become a better runner at this point. And I have my goals, and I have my workouts that I'm doing. And I know that if I don't sacrifice properly, I'm not going to get what I want. And so what does that mean? Well, to run 60 miles a week and to get this mileage in and to perform my best requires a lot of discipline and a lot of sacrifice. I have to make sure I go to sleep at a certain time and wake up at a certain time. I have to take my supplements every day. I have to eat correctly. I have to stretch every day. I have to sacrifice my time where I would rather do other things that are not as productive or not as important, but still, I want to do these things. I want to, watch trash TV, or, just hang out and just not do anything. I have to sacrifice those wants and needs for this goal that I'm striving for. And when I don't sacrifice properly on those days where I decide to stay up on my phone instead of going to sleep, or I don't wind down properly, and so I get low quality sleep, I pay for it the next day. And maybe I missed that workout, or that workout is unnecessarily painful. And so I think these are things that this is a principle that we can all relate to, and we know, and we can ask ourselves, has there ever been a time where you set a goal and you didn't do everything that you were supposed to do, and you didn't achieve the goal? I'm sure everyone has been faced with that. And there's also, the opposite. Has there been a time where you set a very difficult goal and you gave it your all and you achieved it, So the nature of sacrifice there is, or at least the injunction there as it relates to sacrifice, is that you're supposed to sacrifice properly, and if you don't, you will not be blessed. Now, what happens when you don't get blessed? Because sometimes that happens. Obviously, everyone has gone through a time where they wanted something and maybe they thought they were giving it their all, but due to some limitation, something that maybe they didn't know, maybe they're unaware, or maybe somewhere unconsciously they were, sabotaging themselves because they wanted to have an excuse to say, well, I didn't really try hard. And so, if I lose, or if I don't get that promotion, or if I, don't win this contest, then I can always fall back and say that I, didn't give it my all. But anyway, there are times where we won't receive the blessing. And then there we face another crossroads where we can decide to adapt and learn and become better, or we can give into those negative impulses that make it easier for us to make ourselves look better. We can make excuses. We can blame the world. We can blame the circumstances. We can blame another person. We can blame our friends. Whatever it takes for us to not have to take responsibility for the fact that we failed. And we can all understand that. Like, no one likes the feeling of failing. Most people don't like the feeling of failing, but perhaps that's just a different level of attention. Some people, I don't want to say love failure, but they embrace moments of learning and opportunities to improve because they understand. And I try to embody this as much as I can. There are some people who just understand that failing is part of the journey to success and to receive the blessing. And that's, that sacrifice of arrogance and hubris and the acceptance of humility is part of the journey to improving yourself and becoming better. And so when things don't go your way, you have a choice. You can either accept responsibility and learn and adapt, or you can blame other people and give in to your resentment. And we see what happens with Cain and the choice that he makes. And instead of learning from Abel, who is better than him in a sense, he kills him and he takes down. Dr. Peterson has called Abel the ideal of Cain. And so Cain destroys his ideal. And that's another thing that I believe we can all relate to. There are times where we won't clarify our success, or we won't really give into the fact that we admire someone or that we would like something that someone else has. Because once you clarify the conditions for success, well, then you also clarify the conditions for failure. And there's something about this negativity bias that we have as humans, where we will do so much to avoid failure, or it's not even to avoid failure at times. Sometimes it's just to avoid the conception of the potential failure. That's not the right way to, from reading this story, the proper way to move forward through life, to contend with your ideals, to set your goals, to sacrifice, and to try to receive blessings, is to have the faith that if you sacrifice properly, which to me means to stop doing what you know to be wrong and to do what you know to be right, then you will receive the blessing. And even in the situations when you don't receive the blessing, you look inward first and you ask yourself how you can be better, and take stock of your situation and identify those bad habits that need to be stopped and those good habits that need to be implemented. To adopt the attitude of Cain would not be optimal. It would not lead to the redemption necessary to be able to get to the point where you can sacrifice properly and receive the blessings like Abel. All right, I think I'm going to stop there. Talked about sacrifice a lot, talked about stories a lot more than I thought I was going to talk about. Next video maybe would be about suffering, if that's still on my mind. But that's the video. Thank you guys for listening. I hope I wasn't shaking this camera too much. Oh gosh. Thank you all for your attention, and I'll see you in the next video.